So you probably clicked on this video because you have a camera and you don't know how to use it. You bought the most expensive camera in the world and you thought that you could just open up the camera and just record and that you're gonna get the best Hollywood grade video and the best quality ever. That's the mistake you made. Before buying your camera and investing into a camera, you need to know what camera basics are first. And in this video, we're gonna go over components that you need to learn to bring your footage to the next level. All with these simple tweaks and these simple steps that I'm going to teach you right here. If you're new to the channel, subscribe to the YouTube channel right now, turn on post notifications, like this video, and share it with someone that needs to know this. So the components that we will be talking about in this video consist of your frame rate, which means your FPS, or in other terms, frames per second, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. You need to learn these 4 things when it comes to your exposure in your camera. There are many different other camera settings and camera basics, but the specific camera basic component that we're gonna learn today is your exposure. And these 4 things work together to get the right exposure. So I'm gonna teach you how to expose your camera and how to bring light the right way. I wanna first start off by saying this. Buying the most expensive camera is the worst mistake you could ever make if you're starting off. Don't do that. You're wasting your money. You might as well return the camera right now. I always give people this analogy, right? You can get better results on a cheap camera with your camera basics mastered than get an expensive camera and not know how to use camera basics. And that I can say that confidently, right? When people hear the word camera, they think that they could just pick it up like they could pick up their iPhone and just go to their camera app and just record just like that. That entirely is not true. When you invest into a mirrorless camera, a DSLR camera, a cinema camera, when you invest into an actual camera with a lens, there are things that you need to know to be able to get that footage and to get that crispy, buttery, cinematic look like you see right now. That's your first mistake. Now, the first component I want to talk about is frame rate, FPS. You're probably wondering, what the heck does FPS stand for? It stands for frames per second. To better explain it, frames per second is how many pictures your camera can take in 1 second, which ultimately turn all of those photos into a video if you play them back frame by frame. Now, there's photography cameras, there's many different types of cameras, but I'm talking per se a video recording camera, a camera that has the ability to record, okay? Now, when you have a camera, right, you obviously have an audience that's watching you, that's watching the video that you've created, that you've presented, that you put all your time into. The key factor is you want to make that video natural to the human eye. So the camera and the lens act like our body and our eye. The camera is the body, the lens is the eye to the body, right? So whenever you're making your film, you need to be thinking to yourself, how is the person that's watching this video going to see this? I want to make this as natural to them and as comfortable to them as possible. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, you taught me what frames per second is, you taught me what FPS is, what frame rate is. What's the best frame rate to shoot at? Our eye is naturally used to seeing 24 frames per second. That's the cinematic standard. That's the Hollywood standard. Every Hollywood movie that you watch in theaters, every movie in general that you watch in theaters is rendered in 24 frames per second. Why? Because it is natural to the human eye and it gives you that buttery cinematic look. Like right now, I'm shooting this video right now in 24 frames per second right now. And it looks natural to you and it looks good to you because of that 24 frames per second, right? If I shoot in 30 frames per second, my video will look like a news broadcast. And sometimes news broadcasts look disgusting. Or you take out your iPhone and you just record at 60 FPS and that's just it. That doesn't look cinematic. If you want to stay at that level, that's on you. But if you want to take your filmmaking, if you want to take your videos to the next level and get that buttery, crispy look, these are the necessary steps that you have to take to be able to get that cinematic look, shooting 24 frames per second. The only time you should be shooting in a higher frames per second is if you're gonna slow that footage down in post or if you're gonna render your video in 24 frames per second. And what I mean by that is when you're editing your video on Premiere Pro, After Effects, whatever it is. On these softwares, you can set your final video of what frames per second you want your video to be at. So if you record in 60 FPS and you render it in 24 frames per second after you finish editing your video, then you're good to go. But if you're rendering it in 60, some people like that look. It doesn't look cinematic, it doesn't look buttery, it doesn't look good to me. I like 24 frames per second. That looks good to me. That's my personal preference. That's the majority of people that watch videos preference. So again, that is the only time you should be using a frame rate higher than 24 frames per second if you're going to slow it down. Now, if you go lower than 24 frames per second, your footage is going to appear choppy. It's going to look like choppy and robotic-y and delayed and everything. And you can use that, but at a special occasion. For example, I shoot music videos, right? I'll use that at a scene where it's talking about drugs or something or a hallucination or something. That's when I'll use that effect because it looks like trippy. But I wouldn't use that on an everyday basis. Like a talking head video like I'm doing right now, I wouldn't do that there because this is in real time. Another thing, you always want to make sure you shoot at the highest resolution that your camera has. For example, I'm using the Sony FX3 right now, right? And I'm able to shoot in 4K. Now, I want to talk about shutter speed. Pay attention to this video because all of these components play a role together. They play a role together to get that nice buttery look. Shutter speed. So what is the definition of shutter speed? Shutter speed or exposure time is the length of time that the film or digital sensor inside the camera is exposed to light when taking a photograph or video. The amount of light that reaches the film or image sensor is proportional to the exposure time. Usually when you look at shutter speed, you'll see the value as 1/ and a number. That's what you call your shutter speed. So think about it like this. The faster your shutter, the more light you allow into your camera. Or in other words, the lower your shutter value rate, the more light you expose in your camera. Shutter speed and FPS go hand in hand together. This is the shutter speed rule that every filmmaker and videographer goes by. At least I hope. Your shutter speed should be double your frame rate, your FPS. So if I'm shooting in 24 frames per second, my shutter speed needs to be 1/48. Sometimes some cameras can't do 1/48, so they'll round it up to 1/50. And you can do 1/50, that's pretty much double, you're just rounding it up. The reason why, I'm gonna show you why right now. If I wave my hand in front of my eyes right now, because remember I told you guys, your eye is naturally used to seeing 24 frames per second. If I wave my hand in front of my eyes, you can't see the details of my hand. It has like a certain motion blur to it. There's a certain motion blur to my hand that doesn't allow me to see the details in my hand. The same thing goes with shutter speed. When you double your shutter speed the right way, when you wave your hand in front of the camera like you guys can see right now, it adds that motion blur to it and it gives that cinematic look to the eye. If you raise your shutter speed higher than double, you will see the details in your hand and your footage will look choppy and it'll look weird. It'll look stale. It won't look cinematic. It won't look appealing to the eye. So with that being said, always keep your shutter speed double your frame rate. The next component is called aperture. Your aperture opens and closes your lens. All of aperture has to do with the lens that you buy. So there's certain lenses that have lower apertures, certain lenses that have higher apertures. But when you raise your aperture on your camera, you're either closing your lens or you're opening it up, which also affects your light. Shutter speed affects your light. The lower you go on your shutter speed, the brighter your image becomes. The lower you go on aperture, the brighter your image comes. Okay? Now, I want you guys to do something real quick. I want you to squint your eyes just a little bit, right? And look at, you see how you can see your eyelashes and whatever you're focused on right now it's kind of dark. It's kind of darker. That's the same way aperture works on a camera. The more you go up in value, the more it closes your lens and the darker it becomes. But the more you open it, the more wider it becomes. Aperture also introduces this term called bokeh. You're probably wondering, what is bokeh? You ever seen those videos like this one where you have a subject in frame but the background is blurred? You see how blurred out my background is and you can't really see and you can't really focus on my background? That is a term called bokeh. Now, when you keep your aperture low and you expose your camera the right way, you'll get this blurry background just like this, depending on your aperture and how low it is. Some lenses can go to 1.4, some lenses can go to 1.8, or like the lens I'm using right now, which is the G Master Sony lens, I'm using an f2.8 lens. Now, you start losing that background field when you start going into 4 or 7 or 10. Now, on your camera, you could either see two things for your aperture. You can see the term F and then the value number, or you can see IRIS and then the value number, okay? If you see those two terms, that's your aperture. Like on this Sony FX3 right now, it says f2.8. That is my aperture. But on some cameras, like my Sony FX6 over there, it says IRIS, but that still calculates your aperture. So if you ever see those two terms, that's what your aperture is on your camera. You always want to keep your aperture at the lowest. If you're taking a picture or recording a video of a subject, you want to make sure your aperture is the lowest. And also, when you zoom in your lens more, your background becomes more blurry. That's another thing. And bokeh is usually talked to as shadow depth of field. You always want to have shadow depth of field in your videos because it grabs the focus and the attention of your viewer. Now, for the last and final component that we're going to talk about in this video, it's called ISO. You're probably wondering, what the heck is ISO? ISO pretty much saves your butt sometimes. In some cameras are not good at it, but some cameras are. So on your camera, your ISO is how sensitive your camera sensor on your camera is. ISO introduces digital light. So once you have your shutter speed and your aperture right, but the image still kind of looks dark to you, you can introduce more light to your camera by raising your ISO value. The higher up you go in number values on your ISO, the more light comes into your camera, but the more grain that's introduced in your camera. Nobody wants to see a video where you can see grain all over the place and it looks bad quality. You should only be able to use that feature when you can pull it off the right way. If you're looking like for a 90s look or 80s look or a certain look, that's when you can introduce grain into a video. But even then, I always suggest people add grain in post instead of getting grain straight out of their camera, because if you get grain in your camera, it lowers the quality of your image. It lowers the quality of your video. So I always suggest for people, try to keep your ISO at the lowest it possibly can be before you introduce it. Because if you bring your ISO high, you're gonna get grain. Now you're probably wondering, okay, what if my image is dark and I have to bring my ISO high and I have no other choice? There is another choice. Getting your lighting right. As you can see, I'm at a low ISO right now. My ISO is at 2000 right now, but my image still looks good. Why? Because I have a key light, I have a hair light, and I have ambient light in the background of my office. this, right? So you want to make sure those components, your shutter speed, your frame rate, and your aperture, including the lighting in your video itself, is good to go before you introduce ISO. I set my softbox to a certain level of light to where I'm comfortable and I can open my eyes to you guys and be able to look at you guys and be able to talk to you guys. But let's say my image is still dark. That's when I would introduce ISO. Not too high, but to a point where the image looks nice. So ISO should be the last thing you look at when it comes to your camera basics and setting your exposure. If that's not the last thing you look at, you've got it all wrong. Now, as for me, I'm using a Sony FX3. This camera is really good in low light, but not every camera is the same. You might have to get a lower budget camera and you might have to get your camera basics right before introducing ISO. And all of these components serve as exposure, which means bringing light to your center and your camera body, and they all play together. Okay, so now you've dialed in all your settings. All of your camera basics are the way they're supposed to be, but you find yourself shooting in broad daylight where the sun is out and it's extremely bright outside. Your ISO is at the lowest value and all of your camera basics are right, and your image still looks white, and it still looks crazy white like this right here. You're probably wondering, okay, what do I do in that situation? Some people would say turn up your shutter speed rate to make the image darker until it becomes darker. But if you do that, you won't get that buttery motion blur look. Or turn your aperture up and it will also make your image darker, which it really would, but you won't get that shadow depth of field at all. It would just be a flat image, no shadow depth of field, no focus, no nothing. I still always suggest keeping your shutter speed double your frame rate and putting your aperture low as possible. Now you're probably wondering, okay, well then how do I fix it if you're telling me to do that? This is where this bad boy comes into play. Bam. This is called a ND filter. And what an ND filter does is that it acts like sunglasses. So if you're out in the sun and it's too bright outside and you put sunglasses, it's gonna make your eyes darker. There's a whole bunch of ND filters that are designed for your specific lens, and you got to find your specific lens measurement and find the right ND filter to use. There's many different types of ND filters. There's some that you can change the darkness like this, and you can make it more bright by adjusting it, and you would put this on your lens and it would automatically make your image darker, and you would be able to adjust it depending on how bright or how dark you want your image to be. This ND filter is a lifesaver. If I didn't invest into one of these, majority of my shoots would not come out to the way that they did. That ND filter saved my butt. The only time you use an ND filter is if you have all of your camera basics dialed in the right way, but you still have a bright image and your image is still not the way that's supposed to look in broad daylight. An ND filter will come into play and act like sunglasses for your lens. Once you've learned and mastered all of these components, your filmmaking and your video footage will be taken to the next level, I promise you. My filmmaking career and my journey and my skills have elevated so much since I mastered these components. You must master these components. You have to if you want to take your filmmaking to the next level. If you guys enjoyed this video and if you guys learned something new, I want you guys to like this video. I want you guys to comment down below, and I want you guys to share this video with someone that needs to learn this. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on post notifications so that you never miss out on another fire upload like this one right here. You can stay connected with me on all my other social medias as listed below. And also, I have a filmmaking course coming soon, very, very soon, where we talk about everything you need to know when it comes to videography, filmmaking, photography, video production. Everything you need to know will be involved in that course. Also, I will be teaching in this course how to go viral on social media. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and make sure you stay connected. My name is Kevin, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.